Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. A while back, Battlefront II came out and we did a whole playthrough of the story campaign and learned a few cool things about Imperial Special Ops and some other interesting background information about the Galactic Civil War. But in all honesty, the gameplay was just terrible and I primarily played it for the lore and haven't touched it much since.
Oh snap, didn't see that coming. I mean, he did, but...
Look alive, agents. We can grieve later.
Wow, that was...
Right now, we need to move.
They're very well trained. I'd probably just sit down and start crying if I were an Imperial. I saw that happen. It's like a few million people. Oh man.
Now you guys know we talk a lot about Star Wars combat on this channel, looking at weapons, vehicles, and tactics. Sometimes we even relate it to real life situations. But all that was done through books, movies, and cartoons, and it was basically just us learning from first-hand accounts of actual individuals who were involved in Star Wars battles. But what if we got to experience all that combat firsthand? This is when I began seeing Battlefront not just as some mediocre FPS, but as a great tool and simulator for all types of different Star Wars combat scenarios. It can teach us a lot about what it actually was like to be involved in some of these battles. And let's be realistic, a lot of you guys don't want to play this game or can't play this game, so I'm going to do it for you guys. Today we're going to be doing some preliminary research using this game, and I'm going to break down some things I learned about infantry combat in the Star Wars universe. We recently broke down the differences between firearms and blasters, looking at the pros and cons of both types of weapons. We talked a lot about how much damage the blaster did along with accuracy and the speed of projectiles. But there's one thing you can't really get a good grasp on until you're under heavy enemy fire, and that's how quickly blasters actually overheat. In our scenario during the Battle of Hoth, a member of the 61st Mobile Infantry is on leave for additional training at Echo Base. As the Empire launches his ground assault on the Rebel position, our soldier finds himself a part of the rear guard completely surrounded by Imperial forces inside one of the starship hangars. With most Rebel positions destroyed or routed, he is heavily outnumbered and trigger discipline is a must. Unlike firearms, blasters use gas cartridges which last anywhere from 100 to a few hundred rounds, so reloading is less frequent and ammo is a lot lighter, but because of the high energy of these superheated projectiles, blasters overheat a lot quicker than firearms do. And an undisciplined soldier who isn't able to watch their temperature gauge can quickly find themselves holding a useless steaming hunk of metal, which can be extremely dangerous in the middle of a firefight. Right now, our trooper is using the Blastech A280C, the main assault blaster rifle of the Rebel Infantry. It's an all-around balanced weapon, but as you can see, sustained semi-automatic fire will quickly disable the weapon, and oftentimes our soldier has to either run away from an engagement or pull out his backup scattergun.
Full assault!
Or even melee stormtroopers. Now as the battle wore on, our trooper picks up the DC-15LE, a heavily modified blaster rifle from the Clone Wars period. This was sometimes used by Rebel support gunners. It's an area suppression weapon and much less accurate than the Clone Wars era DC-15, but has a much higher firing rate, but really can only be used in small bursts and can sustain fire for a very short period of time when compared to similar firearms like machine guns that we have here on Earth. Now there is a special overload firing mode which disables the heat sensor, but it can only be used sparingly, and there's also the potential issue of the blaster becoming permanently damaged or even blowing up. As brave as our Rebel trooper was, the Battle of Hoth was a messy affair, and most of the Rebel rear guard was eventually killed or captured. They left it out of the movie, but yeah, being a Rebel trooper is incredibly dangerous. Another thing I noticed was that most frontline infantry units didn't have sidearms along with their main small arms. Now this could be because most small arms had very large magazine capacities and a sidearm wasn't necessary, but from what we can tell, only officers or special units had sidearms or blaster pistols. During the Battle of Endor, Han Solo played a big part in the ground operations leading Rebel Special Forces against the Imperial garrison on the moon. Han Solo, armed with the DL-44, was able to do a considerable amount of damage. While the DL-44 has a slow firing rate, it puts down most stormtroopers with one shot as long as you hit center mass. The plastoid armor basically did nothing to stop the bolt from this weapon. Solo also had special power packs that allowed for more rapid fire, but as with the overcharge mode on other blasters, this was a dangerous thing to do as it could permanently disable the weapon. On the other side of the battle, you had Imperial Stormtrooper officers wielding low-powered pistols, which they could easily put down a rebel with, but they also overheat very quickly. It's pretty apparent by their kit that these officers aren't equipped for frontline battles, which is kind of strange because they oftentimes end up in the middle of a firefight anyway. Now, I had always assumed that personal shields weren't that prevalent in Star Wars combat, but after playing Battlefront, I realized that's actually a misconception. And I'm not just talking about the shields that Gungans use or the ones that are found around destroyer droids. It seems like many support gunners deployed shields during the Galactic Civil War, and these wrapped around their weapons and gave them frontal cover. During the Kessel Revolt, which was a scene during the Solo films, Imperial Stormtroopers eventually responded to the riot that was happening on the planet and made great use of these shields in the tight corridors of the mines. Sometimes an entire assault squad would be stacked behind one of these shield-wielding soldiers, not so different from the riot shields that are used by modern-day SWAT teams. Now, one of the drawbacks of these personal shields is the large amount of energy they require, but because most support gunners already are carrying personal generators on their backs for their automatic blasters, the power is readily available. The second problem with personal shields is the massive amount of radiation they can emit. That's why not all units carry these types of shields. It's also why we rarely see a shield unit that covers the entire body. Although it should be mentioned that in Legends, the Chiss were able to reverse the polarity on their shields and limit the radiation exposure. Scouts also used a different type of shield, which projected a bubble around the wearer. This prevented any fire from hitting them, but also prevented them from firing out. It was a good way for a lightly armed scout to disengage from a target that was overwhelming them. Officers could also carry hand-deployed shield barriers that cordoned off certain areas off and made safe zones in otherwise exposed and dangerous areas. This was especially helpful if a medic needed some cover in the open. Overall, shields were not only a part of Star Wars combat, but an extremely important tactical tool.
Full assault!
Another thing that we suspected that we confirmed through playing Battlefront 2 is that Stormtrooper armor really does stick out in almost every situation, unless maybe you're fighting in the snow.
Little sweep!
And while that might not seem like a big deal, when in the middle of a firefight, seeing your enemy a second before they see you is a big deal. It should be noted that the Stormtrooper armor does seem to be able to take 1 or 2 direct blaster hits and gives the wearer more protection than the average soldier, but against slug throwers like close-range scatter guns, they were more or less useless. In the hypothetical ground assault of the Rebel base on Yavin 4, the Stormtroopers are a bit harder to spot outside, especially if your eyes aren't completely adjusted to the brightness on the outside, but in the darker areas of the hangars, the Stormtroopers stick out a lot, and it's pretty easy to get a jump on them. Now, another thing we mentioned in our firearms versus blasters video was the fact that every blaster round essentially functions as a tracer, and we feel like that's a huge disadvantage. Now, during a brief skirmish on Bespin, we can see that it's very easy to trace blaster rounds back to their soldiers. Oftentimes, this warned us of nearby firefights. While you definitely can do the same thing by listening to a blaster shot go off, it's much better to see a blaster round streak across the air. That way you can determine exactly what angle they're firing from and maybe even the distance. One advantage, however, with these tracer rounds is that it does help hip firing accuracy a lot. It should also be noted that the speed of the blaster rounds seem to be a lot faster in Battlefront 2 than they are portrayed in the films. So guys, that is our video for today. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about this new format. We definitely want to use Battlefront more as a simulator to explore what combat in Star Wars actually was like. There are a lot of different things we can do. For instance, we can look at what it's like to be a Jedi in the middle of a combat scenario, or what it's like to fight a Jedi. Or maybe we can even look at what it's like to fight an Ewok as a Stormtrooper on Endor. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.